Hello and welcome to the I Hit Drums podcast with me, Mark, your teacher for this series, where we're working through my book, I Hit Drums Intermediate 1, which introduces all the elements required of a Grade 3 standard. We're about the halfway point in the book now. We're going to start Lesson 5, and this is quite an exciting one for a lot of people, and I think this is when a lot of players really start to get a sense of their own voice on the kit as they start to develop more independence with their hi-hat foot. And that's what we're going to be looking at this time, adding the hi-hat foot. If you haven't yet got the book, you can find this on my website, ihitdrums.co.uk. And if you're just getting started in drumming, you can also access a free groove starter pack just by subscribing to the website. But let's get started with page 49. Now, because we're going to be using the hi-hat foot for these exercises, we're not going to be actually hitting the hi-hat. Because what would actually really happen in that situation is that you're going to end up with a load of open hi-hat exercises. And that's not what we're going for just now. So all the grooves are actually going to be played on the ride cymbal. So just take note of that when you're working through these exercises. You're going to be playing the ride cymbal with the hand, not the hi-hat. The hi-hat is only going to be controlled by the foot. So if you're a right-handed, right-footed player, this is going to be your left foot. If you're left-handed, left-footed, it'll be your right foot. A really simple way of getting used to using that left foot in a rhythmic sense is to take any groove that you've got with a hi-hat, bass drum and snare drum and change it around so that instead of a hi-hat, you're going to play the ride cymbal, and instead of a bass drum, you're going to play the hi-hat foot. So any bass drum pattern, you're basically going to turn into a hi-hat foot pattern. And that's what you'll see in the example on page 49. We've got the money beat on the bass drum, hi-hat and snare, and then below that, we have the same pattern, but now we've changed that hi-hat for a ride cymbal and the bass drum for the hi-hat foot. And initially, this is what we're going to use to get used to using that left foot. You can even take this concept and use it with some of the songs in a beginner's guide, or even some of the songs that we've already looked at in the book so far. Because initially what we're trying to do is just build some strength and endurance in that other leg. And just like when you first started doing the bass drum, you might have gotten a bit of an achy shin after playing for a while. You might get that same sensation in the other leg by doing the hi-hat foot. So let's take a look at exercise 5.1 on page 50. You have two columns of examples in this exercise. On the left-hand side, we have the original groove, and that's the bass drum, snare drum, hi-hat. And then on the right-hand side, we have the altered groove that we're going to be playing on the ride cymbal and with the hi-hat foot instead of the bass drum. These aren't overly complicated, and you should think of these as a means of getting your leg used to using the hi-hat pedal this way. Now, one important thing to add here, when you're using that hi-hat foot and you're closing those hi-hats together, make sure that those hi-hats are firmly pressed together to get a nice chick sound. Don't release the hi-hats as soon as you've closed them, because that's actually going to create a splash sound. If you are finding that you're getting a bit of a splash rather than a nice clean chick, you might just need to lift your heel a little bit so that it's more the ball of your foot that presses those hi-hats together. What this does is actually put a bit more weight of your leg into the front of the foot and gives you a much firmer press on the hi-hat pedal. So in that first example of 5.1, the original groove sounds like this. And the hi-hat foot version on the right-hand side would sound like this. So find a tempo that's comfortable for you, set the metronome, and then have a go at all those exercises. You don't need to play the left-hand column, that's just there as a reference in case you're not quite sure what you're supposed to be doing with the right-hand column. Once that's taken care of, let's move on to the section marked hi-hat foot within grooves. We're going to be looking at 4 different patterns on the hi-hat foot. The first pattern, labelled A, is where the hi-hat foot is going to fall on 2 and 4. And this is what you'll find in exercise 5.2. This variation's not so bad because the hi-hat foot is going to be falling with the snare drum hand. So as that left hand goes down to hit the snare drum, your left foot is also going to fall down at the same time. Now try and see if you can actually match the movement of that left hand and the left foot. So as you lift that left hand to strike the drum on beat 2, try and lift the leg at the same time so they're moving up and moving down together. You'll probably find that these are both moving up on the and of 1 to come down on beat 2. And then they're both moving up on the and of 3 to come down on beat 4. That first exercise will sound like this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Now you've got 5 other examples within that exercise, so try each of those and make sure you loop them around several times. You can also try and move from one into the next, into the next, into the next. Once you're comfortable with this, we're going to move on to exercise 5.3, and we're actually adding a couple more hi-hat hits here to beats 1 and 3. Now this is slightly more challenging because that hi-hat foot is now going to be falling quite often with a bass drum foot as well as a snare drum hit, and occasionally it'll be falling on its own, for example in the 4th and 5th grooves. You might actually find it easier to start with the ride cymbal pattern playing 8th notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then whilst you're doing that, introduce the hi-hat foot on 1, 2, 3, 4, and then once you're comfortable with that pattern, see if you can add the other drums. The first one should sound like this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, so once again, set your metronome and try those 6 different examples in exercise 5.3. You can loop each one of them, or you can move from one into the next. The actual bass drum and snare drum patterns are identical to what we had in exercise 5.2, and we're going to be using these same patterns in the next couple of exercises as well. So the bass drum and snare drum patterns should start to feel quite familiar, so that you can focus more on that changing pattern of the hi-hat foot. Moving on to exercise 5.4, we've got the hi-hat foot on the off beat. So that means every and count. So as you're counting 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, the hi-hat foot is falling on every and. This variation is quite a strange one. Sometimes I have pupils that really struggle to get this variation, and then other pupils just get it immediately and struggle with some of the other ones. I'd be interested to know which of these you found the hardest and which you found the easiest. So feel free to get in touch on my website or Instagram, let me know. Once again, you might want to start with the ride cymbal pattern and then introduce that hi-hat foot first and then add the drums to this. The first groove in exercise 5.4 should sound like this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
It's easier said than done, but try and get that ride cymbal and hi-hat pattern just to kind of work automatically so that you're actually more focused on the bass drum and snare drum pattern. If you start thinking about the bass drum and the hi-hat foot and the snare drum and the ride cymbal, chances are that you're going to start getting in a bit of a muddle. So try not focus too much on the stationary elements. And in this case, that's the ride cymbal, the hi-hat foot and the snare drum. They're actually the same in every single exercise, but it's the bass drum pattern that changes more often. So that's your moving part, your changing element. And again, we've got the same bass drum and snare drum grooves here, so set your metronome and try all 6 of those, one at a time, looped around, and then moving from one to the next. And then finally, exercise 5.5, we've got the hi-hat foot falling on all of the 8th notes. So this means the hi-hat foot is actually going to be falling on every single hit that you're doing on the ride cymbal. So every 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and will have both the ride cymbal and the hi-hat foot at the same time. And this can be quite tricky for a number of reasons. First of all, it's going to be your right hand on the ride cymbal, if you're a right hand player, and your left foot playing the hi-hat foot. So you've got opposite sides kind of working at the same rhythm, and that alone can be quite difficult. You also have to consider that the hi-hat foot is going to be doing a lot of quick movement, and this just might result in your leg getting quite tired. Again, if you do find that you're getting a bit of an achy shin, for example, when you're doing the hi-hat foot, just take a break. This isn't an endurance exercise. We've got those same 6 bass drum and snare drum patterns with this hi-hat foot variation, and the first one should sound like this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, so I think that's plenty of stuff to work on this week. I'd recommend you focus on one at a time. So get comfortable with the first exercise where you've got the hi-hat foot on 2 and 4, and then maybe do that for a couple of days, and then move on to the next one with the hi-hat foot on 1, 2, 3, 4. And this way you're going to gradually build up some stamina in that leg. But don't overdo it. If it's causing any pain, which it shouldn't, stop. Whereas if it's a little bit achy, just have a break and then try again when you feel up to it. If you're feeling very brave and you feel like you've got all these under wraps, see if you can go from the start of exercise 5.2 all the way through to the end of 5.5. Actually changing between those variations is quite tricky in itself, especially when you're moving from 5.3 to 5.4, where you've got that quarter note hi-hat foot switching to the offbeat. Please follow this podcast if you're enjoying it, and I'd really appreciate if you leave a review. I'd also like to mention here that if you follow my YouTube channel, I'm adding regular videos covering a wide range of topics that will affect you as a drummer. And these include theory and reading, recording drums, some of the elements that we have in a beginner's guide that were in the previous podcast series, some of the elements that we have in this podcast series looking at Intermediate 1, as well as some information on playing live. If you have something in particular that you're not sure about and you'd like to learn more about, let me know. I might be able to help out with that in either a future episode or perhaps a past episode. If not, I can maybe just give you a few pointers. But get to work on those exercises, and until next time, enjoy!